Hello again, everyone. Welcome to the Cipher Brief studio. I'm Tom Nagorski, where we continue to look at the seismic shifts, really no other word for it, that are happening between the United States and Russia, the United States and Europe, implications for the war in Ukraine, but really the whole geopolitical situation, and certainly the Transatlantic alliance. We're delighted to be joined today by Kurt Volker, former U.S. ambassador to NATO, who joins us today from Mumbai. It's great to see you, Kurt. And before I ask you a question, I do think it's necessary just to take stock for a moment or recap some of the extraordinary developments we'll be talking about. In no particular order, the Trump administration has opened a dialogue, Mr. Trump himself, with Vladimir Putin. The United States has joined negotiations with the Russians that appear now to be about much more than just the war in Ukraine. There's a real sort of U.S.-Russia rapprochement, or whatever we want to call it. The Vice President of the United States has given a speech over the weekend in Munich that, fair to say, not just critical of the Europeans, but infuriated the Europeans. And now President Trump has taken aim at President Zelenskyy of Ukraine and called him a dictator and so forth. And I'm probably missing a few things. But Kurt Volker, let me just start with a fundamental question. And it would have seemed a few days ago like hyperbole, but are we witnessing, a truly sort of historic shift here, and maybe even the end of the Transatlantic alliance as we know it?
I don't think so,
Mm-hmm.
but we are seeing some troubling things. There's no doubt about that. But I don't think it's quite as bad as that.
Mm-hmm.
But we'll have to see how this plays out. You rattled off all of those recent events. I was in Munich for Vance's speech. I have followed all the Ukraine things very, very closely, and have had a few conversations with some people who've been involved in that on the European side over the past week. I guess a couple of thoughts. I think let's start with the most recent thing, President Trump's outburst against President Zelenskyy. He called him a dictator without elections. He said he better change things soon or he won't have a country. And he said that Ukraine should have never started the war, which, of course, Ukraine didn't start the war. And I think I have a couple of reactions to that. First off, it is 180 degrees from where President Trump was on his first day in office when he tweeted that Putin needs to end the war. And he's prepared to escalate through sanctions or otherwise if Putin doesn't. Here, he didn't mention Russia or Putin at all. When you think about dictators, Putin's been in power for 25 years. I think he qualifies far more than Zelenskyy does. And it was Russia who started this war. And as President Trump has said in the past, was started largely because as Trump perceived it, and I think Putin perceived it, there was a lack of resolve in the West, a weakness in the Biden administration that Putin wanted to exploit. So he has completely gone the opposite direction in the most recent set of exchanges. One thing I can think of to explain that is, maybe a couple things, but one is he's irritated with Zelenskyy. And so he is, ramping up the pressure on him. Irritated because he presented this draft deal on access to Ukraine's natural resources as payment for U.S. support for Ukraine. And it was a amateurish, one-sided proposition. Looked like it was written by a New York law firm intern. And it was just rejected by Zelenskyy, saying, no, that's not how this is going to work. It basically said the U.S. gets 50% of all the revenue from Ukraine's natural resources in perpetuity, full stop. And no commitments from the United States, no time limit, no dollar limit, just, you give us. So, of course, that's unreasonable. It even said that if there's disputes, that they get resolved under New York law, which, of course, in an international treaty is nonsense. So these are things that can still be done, but they were not done well at all in the first draft here. Zelenskyy rejected it, and I think that got Trump irritated. And Zelenskyy was irritated when he spoke at the Munich Security Conference, partly because of this and partly because of Vance's speech. So he also poked at Trump a little bit. And then just the other day, he said Trump was living in a disinformation bubble.
Right.
So I think that's what Trump is lashing out against. Now, I say there's other things too, because in what Trump said, he is repeating Putin's narrative about Zelenskyy not being a democratically elected leader and Zelenskyy having started the war and Zelenskyy needing to end the war. And that is troubling, because that is the opposite of what's really going on here.
Recognizing excellence in national security, the Cipher Brief Honors Dinner celebrates those who've made a real difference in protecting our nation. It's an unforgettable evening with top leaders in the field. Join us in honoring these remarkable contributions. Reserve your seat now at cipherbriefhonors.com.
And for what it's worth, that's a very plausible notion that we know that poking at Donald Trump won't necessarily get you where you want to go. And pretty recently, Zelenskyy and other Ukrainians seem to be more in the business of trying to flatter him a little bit, I think, before Munich and everything else. But in terms of the damage done over the last 7-8 days, back to the alliance with the Europeans, putting aside for a moment the war, I heard Anne Applebaum, for example, with the Atlantic, and she was at Munich also, listening to all the same speeches. And she said just fundamentally, Europe can no longer count on the United States right now as a friend. Do you think that's also an exaggeration or not?
Well, that's a careful phrase. Count on the U.S. as a friend. I think Donald Trump is very transactional. So the fact that he may like you doesn't necessarily mean he's going to do what you want him to do. He wants to make a transaction out of that. Whether the U.S. can be counted on in that sense, though, where, okay, we're allies, we're partners, we have interests, you have interests, I think there generally yes. And there's a lot of structure and underpinning to the U.S.-European relationship, including through NATO, that doesn't just go away overnight just because the president wants to make deals. So I think it's deeper than that. About the feeling in Munich, I was surprised that our European allies were surprised. J.D. Vance was not going to go there and talk about foreign policy and national security. That's not his lane in the Trump administration. He is the Appalachia guy. He's the guy who's leading on recovering our country from a progressive left and culture wars against the American people and anti-globalism and all that. So I fully expected him to go and make a political, philosophical speech along those lines, how Donald Trump is making America great again. And Europe needs to do the same thing because they are also going through that same cultural battle, political battle. And as he sees it, Europe is losing its identity. It's losing its Westernness, if you will, through what he described as a lack of freedom, lack of free speech, through political correctness and that progressive ideology. Most of the people in Munich are part of that center-left, center-right establishment, so they took offense at this. Although they know it is true because they're dealing with these political movements and domestic political arguments in each of their countries. They just didn't like the fact that he came and said that in a public setting as an American. So it did create a lot of friction in Munich. But I think the proper response from Europe would have been just to say, well, thank you very much. We're glad to have your opinion. We're dealing with these issues too. And in fact, here in Germany, we have an election this week and everything's going to be fine. That would have been the right way, but they got too emotional.
And in terms of what Mr. Trump himself has said, well, let me ask you, you've been the American ambassador at NATO, and it's just hard to put yourself in these kinds of shoes in this kind of moment, I suppose. But, the United States has been 3 years this week, right? For all the ups and downs, unity within the alliance has been I think most would argue, you have argued, a great uh,
Yep.
silver lining in the last 3 years. And in one fell swoop, we've gone from that knitted together support for the Ukrainians against the dictator, as you said, Vladimir Putin. Now we're, seem to be a whole new engagement with the dictator and calling the other guy a dictator. How would you assuage the Europeans about all that?
That's a great question. Fortunately, I don't have to do that. Keith Kellogg was at NATO on Monday, and he tried to do
Right.
that. So Keith Kellogg is now the president's special representative for Ukraine. And he has a very solid understanding of the facts and a solid understanding of who's who and what's what with NATO and Ukraine and Russia. So he was talking them through where we are. If it were me and I were talking with Europeans, I'd say, look, I think what Donald Trump tweeted overnight is more out of pique than certainly not based on the facts. It may reflect his attitude. And if so, that's a concern, but it's not irredeemable. But when you look at the real world, we have differences here, but I think reality has a way of bringing things back to ground zero. I think we're going to have a ceasefire in Ukraine, hopefully this year. But once you have a ceasefire, you need to make it permanent. And so that means deterring Russia from future attacks. And deterrence requires NATO, or at least NATO countries, and the ability to use force. And President Trump is hoping for greater burden sharing. And he talks about this all the time. He wants European allies to spend 5% of GDP on defense. So he's hoping that Europe takes the lead in providing that deterrence against future Russian attacks. So ceasefire, deterrence, burden sharing, that's where I think things are headed, kind of inexorably that direction, even though we have these emotionally charged differences right now.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of deterring Russia, it was President Zelenskyy, I think, but now this idea seems to be getting a lot of traction and discussion that there be an army for Europe,
Yeah.
his phrase. And I guess from his perspective, it's not sure we can count on the United States. We need some kind of, and it's not clear to me. I'm not sure it's fully baked at all yet. When you hear that phrase, not clear what sort of a force we're talking about, but when you hear that phrase, army for Europe, what comes to mind? What do you think is needed, and can it be done?
Yeah. So I was there and listened to his speech, and it struck me as being almost equal measure. We have to protect Europe. We Europeans, meaning Ukraine and Europe, we have to protect Europe against the Russians and the Americans. And that is probably one of the reasons that Trump got angry. If Europe produced an army or a military capability and it were unified in whatever way, I think Trump would be happy about that. That's kind of what he's been agitating for. You guys, you Europeans, should take care of your own security. So it's one of those cases where you see Europe perhaps moving to do the right things, but for the wrong reasons. They should have been developing the European security capability for decades because it's their responsibility and their interest. And yet, if there's any momentum to do it now, it's only because of their anger with Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm. And if there is to be such a force, I saw overnight that there are reports that France and Great Britain are considering a force of 30,000. Do you have any thoughts on if the idea is to deter the Russians? And clearly now we're not just talking about deterring against another assault on Ukraine, but perhaps on the Baltics or Poland or what have you. Thoughts on size and also politically and militarily both. How prepared do you think the Europeans are to come up with something that can do that job?
Yeah. So what is interesting here is that the French called this meeting together after the Munich conference with the British, Germans, Danes, others, to talk about just this very thing. And they left without any common view, which was kind of disappointing. I thought this was a moment where they could actually be defining what their contribution could be. That would be a very constructive way to engage the Trump administration, but they didn't manage to do that. As for numbers, it starts with the mission. What is the purpose of a force? And the purpose is clearly to deter new Russian aggression in Ukraine, but as you said, potentially elsewhere as well. And what therefore is required for that deterrence to be credible, and partly is some capacity, is a serious capacity. It's going to have to have some backup from the United States. It doesn't have to be the U.S. in the lead, but enablers like intelligence and reconnaissance, surveillance, and things. And it's going to have some potential for air power response. And it's going to have a rule of engagement about what to do if fired on by Russia, or if Russia fires on Ukrainians and breaks the ceasefire. So it's going to have to be prepared to fire back. Those are tough decisions to make, and that's what the Europeans are going to have to think through. And when you talk about mission, Zelenskyy was assuming you'd have European forces lined up all along the front line, which I don't see that as a useful mission. There's plenty of Ukrainians who are better capable and battle hardened, and they're ready to be there. I think the European role would be more training, equipping, and assisting, and particularly assisting with air defense, and then the ability to provide additional backup as needed, including from others in NATO. So that means a size of 30,000 could be about right if the mission is defined properly and if they answer that question about what to do if Russia violates.
And we've had, last question, Kurt, we've had folks on the platform, people you know probably, military and otherwise, saying that even if there are no U.S. boots on the ground, they felt it's quite important. Now, they were Americans, but they felt it was quite important that there be some U.S. involvement. And what are your thoughts on that? I think one point made, it may have been Ben Hodges, former commander of army forces in Europe, who said, from the Kremlin's perspective, if there isn't any American backing, involvement, command and control, what have you, that sends a pretty weak signal to the Kremlin. Do you agree?
I completely agree. It's that's the political and the symbolic argument, which I think Ben is right about, that Putin pays attention to that. But then there's also a practical argument, things like satellites, things like intelligence, things like logistical support. Europeans don't have everything they need, and so some U.S. backup support like that would be important. And then I think from an American interests point of view, if we participate, we have influence. That should be something that I think any administration would want, so that we're not seeing Europeans by themselves go do something and not have any influence over how that goes, and then potentially having liabilities if it goes badly.
Yeah. All right. And I guess bottom line, I should ask you back where we began, your level of alarm or concern about this rupture or whatever we call it of the last 8 days is maybe not as high as others?
Not as high as others. I think that there's a lot of emotion in the air right now. But I also think you have some steady hands like Mike Waltz or Marco Rubio. I think you have interests that will drive us in a certain direction, even if some of the static is still in the air. But it is going to take a lot of work and a lot of effort. And I hope, too, that we stay focused on what Trump says and has said for months is peace through strength. And so I hope we stay focused on establishing that position of American strength rather than doing the opposite, rather than giving things away preemptively, or rather than selling out Ukraine and letting Putin have what he wants, because that's going to be perceived around the world as weakness.
Yep. Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Kurt Volker, former ambassador to NATO, really generous of you to join us, and appreciate your time and your insights. Thank you, Kurt.
Good to see you, Tom. Thank you.